The scorching summer sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Redemption Creek as Grace Fairfield clutched her shawl tighter around her face, desperately trying to shield the angry red scars that marred her once beautiful features from the prying eyes of townsfolk. It was 1876, 2 years since the fire that had claimed both her husband and her beauty, leaving her a widow with nothing but painful memories, and a face she could no longer bear to see in the mirror. Grace hurried along the wooden sidewalk, her gaze fixed firmly on the ground. Though she'd only moved to Redemption Creek 3 months ago, she'd already established a reputation as the mysterious widow who never showed her face. Children whispered stories about her, some cruel, some fantastical. Adults pretended not to stare but failed miserably. She had grown accustomed to the sideways glances and hushed conversations that fell silent as she passed. The bell above Harmon's general store jingled as Grace pushed open the door. She needed supplies: flour, sugar, coffee, the basics to sustain her simple life in the small cabin on the outskirts of town. The shop was mercifully empty save for old Mr. Harmon himself, who had shown her more kindness than most since her arrival. "Morning, Mrs. Fairfield," he said without looking up from his ledger. "Your usual order's ready, just wrapped it up not 10 minutes ago." "Thank you, Mr. Harmon," Grace replied softly, her voice muffled by the scarf that covered the lower half of her face. She placed a few coins on the counter. "Now, Mrs. Fairfield, I've told you before, you make the finest embroidered handkerchiefs this side of the Mississippi. This month's batch more than covers your supplies." Grace nodded gratefully. The embroidery work she sold through Mr. Harmon's store was her only source of income. Her nimble fingers were the one part of her that the fire had spared. The bell above the door jingled again, and Grace instinctively turned away from the entrance, adjusting her shawl to ensure her scars remained hidden. "Well, look who's back in town," Mr. Harmon exclaimed. "Knox Yates, as I live and breathe. Thought you'd be driving cattle up to Montana this season." "Change of plans, Mr. Harmon," came a deep, resonant voice that made Grace pause. "Decided it was time to put down some roots." Grace risked a glance over her shoulder. The man who stood in the doorway seemed to fill the entire space with his presence. Tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of a summer storm, he removed his hat to reveal thick, dark hair that curled slightly at the edges. Knox Yates had the weathered look of a man who had spent most of his life under the open sky, but there was a gentleness in his expression that contrasted with his rugged appearance. His eyes met hers briefly before she quickly looked away, but in that moment, Grace felt as though he had somehow seen past her carefully constructed barriers. "Madam," he acknowledged with a respectful nod. Grace mumbled a barely audible greeting and gathered her supplies, eager to escape the uncomfortable scrutiny of this newcomer. "Mrs. Fairfield here is new to Redemption Creek," Mr. Harmon explained. "Moved into old Peterson's cabin about 3 months back. Peterson's place." "That roof was falling in last time I saw it," Knox remarked. "Still is," Mr. Harmon said with a meaningful look. Grace hurried toward the door, but Knox stepped aside, holding it open for her. As she passed, her foot caught on the threshold and she stumbled forward. Knox's hand shot out, catching her elbow to steady her, but the sudden movement dislodged her shawl, exposing the right side of her face. Grace gasped and quickly covered herself again, but not before she saw the flash of surprise in Knox's eyes. Mortified, she pulled away from his grasp and fled down the street, her purchases clutched tightly against her chest. Behind her, Knox watched her go, his expression thoughtful. "Poor woman," Mr. Harmon sighed. "Terrible tragedy, lost her husband in a house fire back east. Got those scars trying to save him, from what little she's told me." Knox nodded slowly, his eyes still following Grace's retreating figure. "Seems like she's carrying more than just physical scars, Mr. Harmon. Ain't we all, son? Ain't we all?" Grace didn't venture into town again for nearly 2 weeks. Her supplies were running low, but the humiliation of that encounter at the general store still burned fresh in her mind. Instead, she focused on her embroidery, creating intricate designs that helped quiet the storm of her thoughts. The delicate flowers and vines that bloomed beneath her needle were a stark contrast to the damaged skin of her hands and face. A knock at her door startled her one afternoon. Visitors were rare, practically non-existent, in fact. Grace hastily arranged her shawl before opening the door just a crack. Knox Yates stood on her porch, hat in hand, looking slightly uncomfortable. "Mrs. Fairfield," he began, "I hope I'm not intruding." Grace remained silent, one hand clutching the edge of the door as if preparing to slam it shut. "Mr. Harmon mentioned your roof needed fixing," Knox continued when she didn't respond. "Thought I might take a look if you don't mind. Storm season's coming and this old cabin won't keep you dry as it is." Grace hesitated. She desperately needed the roof repaired. Water already leaked through in several places whenever it rained, but the thought of having this man around, of being seen by him. "I can work while you're in town, if that would make you more comfortable," Knox offered, seeming to read her thoughts. "You wouldn't even have to see me." Something in his voice, the absence of pity or morbid curiosity, made Grace reconsider. I can pay you with embroidery work," she said finally. "It's all I have to offer." Knox smiled, a warm, genuine expression that transformed his face. "Actually, madam, I could use a good meal more than anything. Been living on my own, cooking too long, and it ain't exactly something to brag about." Despite herself, Grace felt the corners of her mouth lift slightly beneath her scarf. "I believe I can manage that, Mr. Yates." "Knox, please, Mrs. Fairfield." "Grace," she replied softly. True to his word, Knox arrived early the next morning while Grace was gathering eggs from her small chicken coop. She watched from a distance as he unloaded tools and lumber from his wagon and set to work with efficient movements that spoke of a man accustomed to physical labor. By midday, the summer heat had become oppressive. Grace approached the cabin cautiously, carrying a tray with a pitcher of lemonade and a plate of sandwiches. Knox was shirtless, his back glistening with sweat as he hammered new shingles into place. He hadn't heard her approach, and Grace found herself momentarily transfixed by the play of muscles beneath his tanned skin. She cleared her throat, and Knox turned, nearly losing his balance on the roof. "Thought you might be thirsty," Grace called up, keeping her face angled away from him. Knox climbed down the ladder and approached, maintaining a respectful distance. "Much obliged," he said, pouring a glass of lemonade and drinking it down in one long swallow. "Best thing I've tasted in months." As he reached for a sandwich, Grace noticed a long scar that ran from his wrist to his elbow. "Barbed wire," Knox explained, following her gaze. "Got caught in a stampede 5 years back. Wire tore me up something fierce." Grace nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Everyone had scars of some kind," she supposed. "Your roof was worse than I thought," Knox continued. "Gonna take 3, maybe 4 days to get it properly fixed." "I see," Grace replied, uncertain how to feel about his extended presence. "I'll try to stay out of your way," he promised, as if sensing her discomfort. "And I appreciate the food." Over the next few days, a cautious routine developed between them. Knox would arrive at dawn and work until dusk, taking breaks only when Grace brought out food or drink. They rarely spoke more than a few words at a time, but the silence between them gradually became more comfortable than awkward. On the third day, a clap of thunder interrupted the peaceful afternoon. Grace looked up from her embroidery to see dark clouds gathering on the horizon. "Mr. Yates, Knox," she called out. "Storm's coming." Knox glanced at the sky and increased his pace, trying to secure the section of roof he was working on before the rain hit. But the storm moved faster than expected, and fat raindrops began to fall just as he was hammering down the last shingle. "Get inside," Grace shouted as the wind picked up, whipping her skirts around her ankles. Knox gathered his tools quickly and climbed down the ladder just as lightning split the sky. They both ran for the cabin door, Grace reaching it first and holding it open for him. They tumbled inside together as rain began to pour in earnest. "That came up quick," Knox said, breathing heavily. His shirt clung to his chest, soaked through in seconds. Grace hurried to stoke the fire, keeping her back to him. "You should get out of those wet clothes, you'll catch your death." She rummaged through a trunk and pulled out a large shirt. "This was my husband's. It should fit you well enough until your clothes dry." Knox accepted the shirt with a nod of thanks. Grace turned away to give him privacy, busying herself with preparing coffee. "Your husband," Knox said after a moment. "What was he like?" The question caught Grace off guard. Few people asked her about Thomas. Most were too preoccupied with the circumstances of his death or the state of her face. "He was a kind man," she said slowly. "A schoolteacher. He loved books and poetry and teaching children. We were married for 3 years before the fire." Knox buttoned the borrowed shirt. "How did you end up here, so far from home?" Grace's hands stilled on the coffee pot. "After the fire, after my face, people looked at me differently. Some with pity, others with disgust. Even those who tried to hide it couldn't quite manage. I couldn't bear it anymore." She took a deep breath. "I saw an advertisement for land out west, thought maybe in a new place I could just be the strange widow who keeps to herself rather than the woman everyone remembered from before." "And has it worked?" Knox asked quietly. Grace turned to face him, still careful to keep the scarred side of her face in shadow. "Not entirely. People still stare, still whisper, but at least they don't know what I looked like before. They have nothing to compare me to." Knox held her gaze steadily. "I think you're brave, Grace Fairfield." Grace scoffed lightly. "Hiding isn't brave. Surviving is," Knox countered. "Starting over is. Not everyone has the courage to do either." Outside, the storm raged on, rain lashing against the windows and thunder rumbling overhead. Inside, something subtle shifted between them, a door opening just a crack where before there had been only walls. The next day dawned clear and bright, the storm having washed everything clean. Knox arrived earlier than usual to assess any damage from the rain. To his relief, his repairs had held. Grace emerged from the cabin with a basket in hand. "I'm going to gather blackberries from the thicket down by the creek," she announced. Would you care to join me once you're finished for the day?" Knox looked up from his work, surprise evident on his face. "I'd like that very much," he said with a smile. By late afternoon, Knox had completed the roof repairs. He found Grace at the berry patch, her fingers stained purple with juice. She had tied her shawl differently today, still covering most of her face but in a way that allowed her greater freedom of movement. "Roof's all done," Knox announced. "Should keep you dry for many years to come." Grace straightened up, her basket half full of plump blackberries. "Thank you. I don't know how to repay your kindness." "No need," Knox said, reaching past her to pick a berry. Their hands brushed briefly, and Grace didn't pull away as quickly as she might have before. "These look mighty fine. Planning to make a pie, I thought I might," Grace replied. "Would you stay for supper? It seems a small enough thank you for all your work." Knox's smile reached his eyes, crinkling the corners. "I'd be honored." They worked side by side, filling the basket with berries as the afternoon sun warmed their shoulders. Knox told stories of his years as a cowboy, driving cattle across the plains, surviving blizzards and drought and all manner of hardship. Grace found herself laughing at his tales, a sound so foreign to her own ears that it startled her into silence the first time. "You have a beautiful laugh," Knox said softly. "You should use it more often." Grace ducked her head, grateful for the shawl that hid her blush. "I haven't had much cause for laughter these past few years." "Maybe that could change," Knox suggested carefully. Back at the cabin, Grace prepared a simple but hearty meal: venison stew, fresh bread, and blackberry pie for dessert. Knox set the table without being asked, moving around her small kitchen as if they'd been sharing meals for years instead of just days. As they ate, Knox told her more about himself, how he'd left home at 16 to seek his fortune, how he'd worked as a ranch hand and cowboy before saving enough to buy his own small spread just outside of Redemption Creek. "What made you decide to settle down?" Grace asked, curious about this man who seemed so at ease with the open road. Knox considered her question. I suppose I got tired of always moving, always being a stranger, wanted someplace that felt like home. He paused, meeting her eyes across the table. Wanted people who might miss me if I left. The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken possibilities. Will you come to town with me tomorrow? Knox asked suddenly. I need to pick up some supplies and there's going to be a social at the church. Nothing fancy, just folks gathering for music and conversation. Grace tensed visibly. I don't go to town gatherings. I know, Knox said gently. But maybe it's time you did. Not everyone is as judgmental as you might think. You haven't seen all of my face, Grace whispered, her hand unconsciously rising to touch her scarf. You don't know what you're asking. Knox reached across the table, his hand stopping just short of touching hers. I'm asking to spend more time with you, Grace, that's all. Grace stared at his outstretched hand for a long moment before slowly, hesitantly, placing her scarred fingers in his palm. I'll think about it. That night, after Knox had gone, Grace stood before her small mirror, something she rarely allowed herself to do. Slowly, she unwound the scarf from around her face, revealing what the fire had left behind. The right side of her face was a landscape of red and pink scar tissue, pulling her eye and mouth slightly downward. The damage extended down her neck and shoulder, a permanent reminder of the night she had lost everything. Grace traced the largest scar with her fingertip, remembering the agony of the flames, the desperation as she'd tried to reach Thomas through the burning debris. She'd failed to save him, and in return, had been marked forever. Could someone like Knox Yates truly look at her without revulsion? Would the kindness in his eyes turn to pity or disgust when confronted with the full reality of her disfigurement? Grace rewrapped her scarf with practiced movements. She wasn't ready to find out. Knox arrived the next morning with his wagon, dressed in his Sunday best, a clean shirt, polished boots, and a new black hat. His face fell slightly when he saw that Grace was dressed in her usual simple dress, her face still carefully concealed. I'm sorry, she said before he could speak. I can't go to the social, but I will go to town with you if the offer still stands. Knox's expression brightened. Of course it does. The wagon's all ready. The ride to Redemption Creek was quiet but not uncomfortable. Knox didn't press Grace about her decision, and she was grateful for his understanding. As they approached the town, however, her anxiety grew. She pulled her shawl tighter, ensuring that not a single scar was visible. You know, Knox said conversationally, when I was 16 and first struck out on my own, I got caught in a prairie fire. Burned my arm pretty bad. He rolled up his sleeve to reveal more scarring she hadn't noticed before. For the longest time, I wore long sleeves even in the hottest weather, afraid of what people would think of the marks. Grace glanced at him. What changed? Met an old cowboy with a face full of smallpox scars, mean-looking fella until he smiled, had the kindest eyes I'd ever seen. Taught me that what folks see first ain't necessarily what matters most. They reached the general store, and Knox helped Grace down from the wagon. Mr. Harmon greeted them with raised eyebrows but said nothing about seeing them together. As Knox gathered his supplies, Grace browsed the fabric section, selecting threads for her embroidery work. She was so focused on choosing colors that she didn't notice the group of women entering the store until their whispers reached her ears. That's her, the widow with the hidden face. I heard she's horribly disfigured. And now she's got her claws in Knox Yates. Poor man probably feels sorry for her. Grace froze, the spools of thread trembling in her hands. The cruelty in their voices transported her back to the whispers that had followed her after the fire, the sideways glances, the visible recoil when people saw her uncovered face for the first time. She set down the thread and moved quickly toward the door, needing to escape before tears betrayed her. But Knox was there, blocking her path, concern etched on his features. Grace, what's wrong? She shook her head, unable to speak. Behind her, the women's whispers continued, not quite soft enough to miss. Knox's expression hardened as he caught the drift of their conversation. He looked past Grace to the group of women who fell silent under his stern gaze. "Ladies," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the store, "I'd appreciate it if you'd mind your own business and leave Mrs. Fairfield alone. She's twice the woman any of you are proving to be right now." The women flushed with embarrassment, and Mr. Harmon cleared his throat awkwardly. Knox turned back to Grace, his voice softening. "Let's finish our shopping and get out of here. Don't let them chase you away." Grace stood rooted to the spot, torn between fleeing and staying. Knox's defense of her had been so unexpected, so fierce, that it had momentarily shocked her out of her panic. "Okay," she whispered finally. "Let's finish." They completed their purchases in tense silence, the other customers giving them a wide berth. As they loaded the supplies into Knox's wagon, the church bells began to ring, signaling the start of the social. "We could still go," Knox suggested gently. "Show them all you're not afraid." Grace shook her head. "But I am afraid, Knox. I've spent 2 years hiding my face because I can't bear the way people look at me when they see it." Knox's hand covered hers on the wagon seat. "What if I told you it wouldn't matter to me? That I already care for the person you are, regardless of what your face looks like?" Grace's heart pounded in her chest. "You can't know that." "Then show me," Knox challenged softly. "Let me see you, Grace, all of you." Grace stared at him, searching his face for any hint of insincerity. Finding none, she made a decision. "Not here," she said. "Take me home first." The ride back to Grace's cabin seemed to take both forever and no time at all. Grace's mind raced with doubts and fears, but beneath it all was a tiny, persistent hope that perhaps Knox was different from everyone else who had looked upon her ruined face. When they reached the cabin, Knox helped her down from the wagon, his touch gentle but firm. They stood facing each other in the yard, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the ground. "Are you sure about this?" Grace asked, her voice barely audible. Knox nodded. "I've never been more sure of anything." With trembling hands, Grace began to unwrap the scarf that had been her shield for so long. Layer by layer, she revealed what she had kept hidden: first her neck, then her chin, and finally, the full extent of the scarring that covered the right side of her face. She kept her eyes downcast, unable to watch his reaction. The silence stretched between them, and with each passing second, Grace's fragile hope began to crumble. Then Knox's hand was under her chin, gently tilting her face up to meet his gaze. His eyes held no disgust, no pity, only tenderness and something deeper that made her breath catch. "You're beautiful, Grace Fairfield," he said, his voice husky with emotion. Grace's laugh was bitter. "I'm many things, Knox Yates, but beautiful isn't one of them, not anymore." "You're wrong," Knox insisted. He raised his hand slowly, telegraphing his movements so she could stop him if she wished. When she didn't pull away, he lightly traced the edge of the largest scar that ran from her temple to her jaw. "These are marks of courage, of survival." Tears filled Grace's eyes, blurring her vision. "No one has touched my face since the doctors," she whispered. Knox leaned forward and with infinite gentleness pressed his lips to the scar he had just traced. Grace gasped, her eyes flying wide open. "What are you doing?" "Showing you that these scars don't frighten me," Knox murmured against her skin. "That nothing about you frightens me." He kissed another scar, this one near her eye, then another at the corner of her mouth. Grace stood frozen, overwhelmed by sensations she had thought never to experience again: the warmth of another person's touch, the tenderness of their regard. Knox's lips mapped the landscape of her scars with reverence, as if each mark told a story he was privileged to learn. When he finally pulled back, Grace was crying freely, tears streaming down both the smooth and scarred sides of her face. "Why?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Why would you do that?" Knox cradled her face in his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. "Because I'm falling in love with you, Grace. Because your scars are part of you and I want all of you." Grace's heart felt too full, expanding with emotions she had buried so deeply she'd thought them lost forever. "I'm afraid," she admitted. Afraid to hope, afraid to trust, afraid to believe this is real. Then we'll take it slow, Knox promised. Day by day, but I'm not going anywhere, Grace, not unless you send me away. Over the following weeks, Knox became a constant presence at Grace's cabin. He repaired the sagging front porch, fixed the leaking water pump, and built new shelves for her growing collection of embroidery threads. But more importantly, he helped Grace rebuild her confidence, one small step at a time. The first time she ventured into town without her scarf, Knox was by her side, his hand steady at the small of her back. People stared, of course. Some even gasped. But Knox's unwavering presence gave Grace the strength to hold her head high. When the town busybody, Harriet Simmons, made a cutting remark within earshot, Knox didn't need to defend Grace, she found her own voice. "Yes, Mrs. Simmons, my face is scarred," Grace said calmly. "I got these trying to save my first husband from a fire. What's your excuse for your unkindness?" The woman had sputtered and retreated, and something shifted in the town's perception of the mysterious widow. She was no longer an object of gossip, but a woman of remarkable courage. As summer faded into autumn, Knox and Grace's relationship deepened. They shared meals and stories, hopes and fears. Knox taught Grace to ride again, something she hadn't done since before the fire. Grace taught Knox to appreciate poetry, reading aloud by lamplight on cool evenings. One crisp October day, Knox invited Grace to see his ranch for the first time. It was smaller than she had imagined, just 100 acres with a modest cabin and barn, but Knox spoke of his plans with such enthusiasm that Grace could envision the thriving cattle operation he dreamed of building. "It needs a woman's touch," Knox admitted as he showed her around the cabin. "Been living like a bachelor too long." Grace ran her hand along a rough-hewn table. "It has good bones, like its owner." Knox caught her hand and brought it to his lips. "Grace, I've been thinking about something important." Her heart skipped a beat at the seriousness in his tone. "Oh." "I love you," Knox said simply. "I love your strength, your kindness, your courage. I love the way you see beauty in small things, the way you laugh when you think no one is listening." He took a deep breath. "I want to build a life with you if you'll have me." Grace's free hand rose to touch her scarred cheek, a habit she hadn't quite broken. "Knox, are you certain? People will talk. They'll say you settled for less, that you could have had any woman in the territory." Knox shook his head, a smile playing at his lips. "Let them talk. I'll be too busy being the happiest man alive to listen." He dropped to one knee, still holding her hand. "Grace Fairfield, will you marry me?" Tears welled in Grace's eyes, but they were tears of joy, not sorrow. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you, Knox Yates." Their wedding took place on a golden afternoon in November. To Grace's surprise, nearly the entire town of Redemption Creek turned out for the ceremony. Mr. Harmon gave her away, beaming with fatherly pride. Even Harriet Simmons attended, offering stiff congratulations at the reception. But the moment that would live forever in the memory of everyone present came just after the minister pronounced them husband and wife. There, in front of the entire town, Knox Yates tenderly framed his bride's face in his hands and kissed every visible scar before finally claiming her lips in their first kiss as a married couple. The gesture was so full of love and acceptance that several women dabbed at their eyes, and more than one gruff cowboy cleared his throat to disguise his emotion. "I want everyone to know," Knox whispered against Grace's ear, "that I treasure every part of you. That these scars are badges of honor, not something to hide." Grace, who had once thought happiness forever beyond her reach, felt her heart overflow with love. "Thank you for seeing me," she whispered back, "for truly seeing me." As they walked back down the aisle together, Grace's face was fully visible for the first time since she'd arrived in Redemption Creek. She no longer needed to hide. In Knox's love, she had found the courage to face the world as she was, scars and all. Spring came to Redemption Creek with a riot of wildflowers and the birth of new calves on the Yates Ranch. The small cabin had been expanded over the winter, with Knox adding a larger kitchen and a comfortable front porch where Grace often sat to do her embroidery work, which had become quite sought after throughout the territory. On a particularly beautiful morning, as sunlight streamed through the windows of their home, Grace placed Knox's hand on her still flat stomach. "I have something to tell you," she said, her eyes shining, Knox's expression transformed from confusion to wonder in an instant. "Are you certain?" Grace nodded, her smile radiant. "Dr. Miller confirmed it yesterday. We're going to have a baby, Knox." Knox whooped with joy, lifting Grace into his arms and spinning her around the kitchen. When he set her down, his eyes were suspiciously bright. "I never thought I'd have this," he admitted. "A home, a family, a woman I love more than life itself." "Neither did I," Grace replied, touching his cheek. "After the fire, I thought my life was over, that all I had to look forward to was loneliness and shadows." She pressed her forehead to his. "You brought me back into the light, Knox Yates." Knox kissed her then, his lips finding the familiar paths of her scars before meeting her mouth in a kiss that promised forever. "And you gave me a home to come back to, Grace Yates, a place where I belong." Together, they stepped out onto their porch, arms around each other, facing the future with open hearts. The scars that had once defined Grace's existence were now simply part of a larger story, one of loss and healing, of courage and second chances, of a love strong enough to see past surface wounds to the beauty that lay beneath. And as the morning sun warmed their faces, Grace felt truly beautiful for the first time in years, not despite her scars, but with them because they had led her here, to this man, this love, this life that once seemed impossible. In the years to come, the story of the scarred widow and the cowboy who kissed her scars before the entire town would become something of a legend in Redemption Creek, a reminder that true love sees with the heart, not just the eyes, and that sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with wounds that only the right person can heal.